They say it was just a dog, tied up and left in the snow, until a man rescued her. But this wasn't only a rescue, it was the first step on a path held together by memory. A dog who never forgot. A man who never stopped hoping. Behind every careful footstep was the quiet ache of a father still searching, still listening for the voice he once knew. If you believe that love leaves traces, that some bonds outlast the silence, stay. Like the video, subscribe, and let the story lead you home. The snow had been falling for days, whispering across the slopes of Appaloosa Ridge like an old hymn that had forgotten its words. The wind carried with it a low, steady moan, more memory than sound, as it pushed through the thinning pines and settled across the frozen outskirts of Blackstone, a small Montana town where winters came early and spring arrived late, if at all. The hills were empty this time of year, save for the stubborn tracks left behind by elk, the occasional coyote, or the quiet footprints of a man who no longer had reason to be seen. That man was Hank Cooper, a 58-year-old former wildland firefighter whose frame had once been broad and commanding, but had since thinned beneath the weight of solitude and loss. His beard had gone mostly gray, though streaks of brown clung stubbornly near his jaw, and his eyes, once sharp with purpose, had faded into a kind of weary steel. Hank had built a life for himself on the edge of isolation, tucked in a weather-beaten log cabin just past the South Ridge, where no neighbors asked questions and no visitors stayed long. After the fire that stole his daughter 6 winters ago, he'd stopped looking for things he couldn't get back. Or so he told himself. He was on horseback now, bundled in a canvas coat lined with old wool, his breath curling out ahead of him like smoke from a dying ember. His mare, a quiet Appaloosa with mottled flanks and a gait as steady as snowfall, walked without protest. They'd gone out to check an old trail marker he'd promised Clara, the town vet, he'd repair before the next storm. It wasn't urgency that turned him around. It was something else. A tug in his ribs, like the echo of a voice that had once called him Dad. He saw it from a distance. At first, he thought it was debris, maybe a carcass left behind by wolves or coyotes. But as he drew closer, he saw the scorched outline of a pop-up camper, the frame blackened and half buried in snow. Smoke still rose faintly from the axle, curling into the gray sky like it hadn't quite decided to let go. Beside it, 3 shapes huddled against the wind. They didn't move, didn't cry out, just waited, silent and too still. Hank dismounted slowly, his boots crunching into the crust of ice beneath him. The snow was fresh, but not untouched. There were tracks deep, hurried, human, and a few smears of blood that had begun to freeze. Near the wagon's husk, charred scraps of rope, a pile of ash and embers still warm, told him whoever had left had done so within the last 24 hours. The embers were too recent, the blood too thin. Someone had been here just yesterday, but something spooked them. They left the fire burning, the ropes half cut. They didn't stay to finish anything. They just ran. The first figure was a dog, an adult German shepherd, medium-sized but clearly underweight. Her coat was black and tan, matted with soot and frost, and a burlap sack was pulled tight around her head, tied with twine near her neck. Her paws were bound, but not cruelly, as if more to prevent escape than to punish. He reached for the knot carefully, muttering nothing, just letting the silence do what words couldn't. As the sack fell away, she didn't bark or bite. She didn't even flinch, just let out a low whimper, the sound closer to memory than pain. One of her ears bore a long scar, healed but harsh, the kind of mark a cage or blade might leave behind. The second shape was curled tightly against her, a small puppy black, trembling its ribs showing even beneath the fur. When Hank touched it, it licked his hand once, a gesture so small it nearly broke him. The third was barely moving. Pale cream in color, she was smaller than the other, maybe the runt of the litter, her muzzle dusted with frost and her breathing shallow. None of them wore tags. None of them had collars, except the adult dog, whose torn leather band was burned along the edge. A glint of metal still clung to it. He pulled his coat off without thinking, wrapping the 3 dogs into its folds, pressing them gently to his chest one by one, as he carried them back to his mare. His fingers, raw from the cold, brushed against the nameplate on the mother's collar. Most of it was unreadable, blackened by fire and time, but one letter still caught the light. Maddie. Hank froze. His breath caught. That name, so small, so loud. For a second, the snow didn't fall, the wind didn't move, and even the memory of fire held still. Maddie, his daughter's name, the same name he had carved into the back of a wooden jewelry box for her 9th birthday. The same name he had whispered into the trees on nights when he thought no one could hear. He stood there for a moment longer, just watching. The dogs didn't whine, they didn't tremble now that they were bundled. The mother had turned her face into the warmth of the fabric, eyes half shut but not defeated. He looked once more at the burned-out wreck behind them. No wagon tracks led away, no boot prints beyond the ones he'd followed in. Whoever had left them had disappeared into the woods without a trail. Or maybe they'd never intended to leave at all. When Hank turned his mare back toward the ridge, the wind picked up again, brushing cold across his cheeks. It carried no answers, but something else moved through the trees, a hush that came not from absence, but from waiting. He tightened the reins and whispered a word he hadn't said in years. Rosie. The dog didn't respond, not outwardly, but her ears shifted just slightly at the name, and that was enough. The cabin sat crouched against the slope, like an animal that had learned not to expect kindness. Hank Cooper eased the door open with a booted foot, his arms wrapped tightly around the bundled forms of the dogs. The wind pushed at his back, reluctant to let him go, but inside the air was still and cold. He stepped across the threshold and lowered them one by one onto the braided rug near the wood stove, the place where warmth was earned but never wasted. The hearth hadn't held a flame in days. He built the fire from memory, not thought-kindling first. Pine branches next, then the thick split logs he always kept ready. Smoke rose through the chimney, like breath long held and finally released. The dogs didn't move much. The mother curled slightly as the heat touched her side, but her eyes remained open, watchful without alarm. The smaller black pup scout, he decided, tucked itself behind her tail, while the pale one, Daisy, gave a quiet sneeze that startled no one but herself. Hank poured milk into a tin saucepan and set it near the flame. He fetched the last 2 cans of wet food from the shelf, the ones he kept in case a stray ever wandered by, and spooned it out into an old pie tin. The puppies lapped at it quickly, tongues clumsy, paws slipping on the metal. The mother sniffed it once but turned her head. Hunger wasn't the first thing she had to recover. He sat beside her without speaking, hands resting on his knees, watching the way her breath lifted the matted fur along her ribs. There was a tired dignity in the way she refused to show pain. He could respect that. He reached out slowly and ran his hand down her neck. When he touched the scar under her ear, she flinched, not violently, just enough. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers found the worn patch of leather still looped around her collar. He traced the burnt edges with his thumb. He hadn't said Maddie's name out loud in months, not because it hurt less, but because he feared what it would do to him if it still hurt the same. He stood then, walking to the narrow shelf above the stove where he kept a box. Inside were the things the world had told him to let go of: a cracked compass with her initials scratched into the back, a pocket recorder with her voice still locked inside, and a canvas pouch full of hand-drawn maps paths she'd helped him mark through the woods, their little game of explorer and cartographer. Maddie had been 9 when she vanished, the age when she still believed Rosie could understand full sentences, and that some trees whispered if you asked nicely. She had freckles that multiplied in the summer, and a laugh that echoed longer than her footsteps. On the day she disappeared, Hank had left the cabin to check fire lines. Rosie was with her, always with her. When the fire turned fast and cruel, it had taken less than an hour to erase the clearing where they had camped. Search parties found nothing but scorched earth and a melted hair clip. People said to bury it, move on, start again. But Hank had known better. There was no starting again from that kind of silence. He sat back down near the fire, the recorder in his lap, thumb brushing the worn play button. He didn't press it. The next morning, Hank loaded the dogs into an old milk crate lined with blankets and tied it to the sled hitch behind his snowmobile. The wind was sharp and loud, but the trail into town was clean, the snow crusted with ice that cracked beneath the runners. Rosie lifted her head once during the ride, ears perked but not alert, more like she was remembering how motion felt. The puppies slept, exhausted by the simple work of survival. Blackstone was still half asleep when he arrived. The town was small enough that nothing stayed secret for long, but distant enough that people pretended not to see what they didn't want to carry. He stopped in front of a squat brick building with a sagging awning, Clara's clinic, small animal care, and feed. The lettering was chipped but neat, painted by someone who still believed in second chances. Clara Wexley was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a low braid, and the hands of a woman who'd stitched more wounds than memories. She had been a field vet during a wildfire deployment in Utah years ago, and something in the smoke had settled in her lungs. Now she walked with a rasp in her breath and an impatience for things that wasted time. Her face was kind but not soft. It was a face built for delivering hard news gently. She stepped out onto the porch as Hank approached, wiping her hands on a cloth already stained from the morning's rounds. "Trouble?" she asked, though her eyes were already scanning the crate. "Found them up ridge," he said, voice gravel thick. "Burned out camper. Someone left them." She knelt without asking, examining Rosie first. Her fingers moved quickly, professionally, checking for breaks, fever, dehydration. When she reached for the scanner, Hank stepped back. The chip reader beeped once, and then a green light blinked. Clara squinted at the screen, then looked up, then back again. The words didn't change. The screen lit up. Rosie, certified therapy animal. Owner, Madeline Rose Carter. Clara's mouth parted slightly, but she said nothing at first. Her brow furrowed, lips pressing into a thin line. She stood slowly, one hand resting on Rosie's back, as if steadying both of them. "I didn't know she was chipped," she murmured. "She was. I put it in myself." Clara nodded, stepping back into the clinic without another word. She returned moments later with gauze, ointment, and a clean cloth. As she worked, her movements softened. She no longer worked on an unknown stray. She worked on a memory. Rosie didn't resist. She let herself be tended to, even as her eyes remained fixed on the snow beyond the porch. Not fearful, not expectant, just waiting. Back at the cabin, Hank laid out fresh bedding by the fire and set the food bowls beside it. Scout curled instantly, nose tucked under tail. Daisy chewed at a scrap of wood before dozing off. Rosie took her place between them without a sound. That night, Hank opened the old box again. He took out the recorder, pressed play, and let Maddie's voice echo once more into the quiet room. "I love you, Rosie," it said, small and crackling. "Don't forget the way home." He didn't sleep. The days bled into one another like brush strokes of the same color, each painted in frost and silence. Since Rosie and the pups had returned to the cabin, Hank hadn't slept a full night, not for lack of warmth, but for the quiet weight of eyes that never looked away. Every morning, just before the sky slipped from indigo to gray, Rosie would stand by the edge of the porch, her gaze fixed northward, as if waiting for a sound that never came or remembering one that never left. Hank noticed, not just the direction, but the way her body leaned, not toward escape, but toward return. Her ears stayed high, her stance steady. She was listening for something she used to trust. He sat at the kitchen table, the maps unfolded before him like old confessions. The pages were smudged, edges curled from years of folding and unfolding, but the lines still held. Fire had rewritten most of the terrain years ago, and Hank had spent countless evenings tracing paths that no longer existed. This time, he drew a circle around the northern bluff, just past the ashfall line. It was a crevice, barely noted during the early search grids, dismissed then as too narrow, too insignificant to offer shelter. But Rosie kept looking that way. He marked it in red. Outside, Scout and Daisy chased each other in awkward circles around a pile of chopped wood, their legs still clumsy, their energy returning. Hank had built them a nest from a bale of hay inside the barn, tucked with wool scraps and his old flannel shirts. They'd grown stronger, louder, more alive. But Rosie waited. On the fifth morning, Hank didn't unroll the maps. He packed his satchel with jerky, water, and an old Polaroid of Maddie taken during a summer camping trip. She was 8 in the photo, holding a pine cone with a gap-toothed grin and Rosie's ear in her fist. He slid the photo into the inside pocket of his coat and stepped out onto the porch. The snow had crusted, firm enough to walk on. The clouds hung low but thin, allowing a pale sun to press faint shadows onto the land. He didn't call Rosie. He didn't need to. She stood, ears flicking, then descended the porch steps before he moved. No leash, no signal, just memory. The trail north was uneven, overgrown in places where nature had reclaimed what man once burned. Hank walked behind her, not leading, but following, letting her choose. The quiet between them was not empty. It was purpose. Rosie led with certainty, but not haste. She paused at places where trees were twisted by old heat, where moss grew sideways, where no path should have been remembered. After the third ridge, the forest thinned. Trees gave way to low shrubs and wind-carved rock. The air here had a taste, bitter and metal-edged, like the way smoke used to cling to his beard after fire season. The northern bluff loomed ahead. At the base of the ridge stood a tree Hank recognized, though it had changed. A pine, once tall and sharp, was now broken its top, sheared off, and trunk blackened near the base. It wasn't the burn that drew Rosie's attention. It was the scar in the bark deep, rough, a tear in the wood where something sharp had gouged years ago. She turned left. There, between two granite shoulders, was the crevice. Not a cave, not quite a passage, but enough to hold something, someone. The opening was no wider than his shoulders, but Rosie stepped through without pause, disappearing into shadow. Hank followed, hands brushing the stone for balance. The air cooled sharply, and the walls pressed close, but after 10 steps, it opened, just slightly. Enough to stand in. He smelled it first. Smoke, ancient and ghostly, not fresh but embedded in the rock. And there, above eye level, where the soot met the clean wall, he saw it. A mark. He scraped off the frost with his glove. Words, scrawled in charcoal, faded by time and snowmelt, but still there. Rosie will remember. If found, bring him here. M. He stared, not at the message, but at the final letter. Just an initial, but it stopped his breath. The handwriting was small, uneven, the way a child might write when the cold stole dexterity from their fingers. Maddie had always signed her maps with that same letter 1 looped line, slightly crooked. She said it was her adventurer's mark. He didn't kneel, he didn't touch it. He simply stood there, eyes locked on the wall, while Rosie sat behind him. She didn't bark or whine. She had done her part. She had come back. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like something waking from a long sleep. It stirred the tips of snow-covered branches and ran fingers through the grass that clung to the base of stone. In that sound, Hank didn't feel lost. For the first time in 6 years, he felt placed. They stayed there until the sun lowered, light falling across the ridge in thin golden blades. On the walk back, Hank didn't lead. He didn't even look at the trail. He watched Rosie. Not every compass needed to point north. The cold settled deeper after they returned from the ridge, as if winter had been listening and now knew where to bury its weight. Hank Cooper moved slower in those days, not from age or frostbite, but from the heaviness of possibility. Every motion in the cabin now came with a whisper of purpose maps, unfolded not just from habit, but hope. Beneath the lantern's glow, he retraced trails on parchment, softened by years and oil from his hands. The ridge was no longer a question. It was a compass point. But where Maddie might have gone next remained a forest of maybes and narrowing guesses. He laid 3 maps across the table, each marked with the burn zones from 6 years ago. The terrain had changed, but the exits hadn't. There were 3 plausible directions a frightened child might take from that narrow crevice. One led south toward the reservoir road, the other 2 cut east. One hugging the timberline, the other bending through ravines where fire crews had barely passed. He marked them in black ink and circled each endpoint with numbers. By morning, he had compiled a list of every outpost, rescue station, and ranger check-in within a 40-mile radius of those 3 exits. The list included places he'd once worked, people he hadn't spoken to in years. Some had retired, some were gone. Still, he drafted letters. Some handwritten, others typed in stiff, careful words. The envelopes were thin, but thick with the kind of weight only questions could carry. He mailed them at the post office in Blackstone, where the clerk, a woman with hair dyed too dark and nails too long to sort quietly, never asked what they contained. Maybe she knew better. Maybe she'd heard the name before. He followed up each letter with calls when numbers existed, and emails when they didn't. The responses came slowly. Most were polite in the way rejection tends to be, measured, impersonal, lined with sympathy so dry it felt like dust. No child by that name recorded. No found dog with a chipped ID matching your case. We suggest grief counseling through the county services. Hank read each one with the same stillness, seated at the edge of his bunk, Rosie's collar in one hand, a thumb pressed into the groove of the charred nameplate. Some nights he almost gave in, almost folded the maps, burned them, walked out into the snow, and let the silence take back what it had stolen. But every morning, Rosie stood at the cabin door, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the north. She didn't bark, she didn't whine, she simply waited. And in her waiting, Hank found the answer to every letter that said he should let go. It was near dusk when the phone rang. The landline hadn't rung in weeks. Most people who cared to speak to him knew better than to call, and the rest no longer cared. The voice on the other end belonged to Dale Anders, the sheriff of Blackstone. Dale was a barrel-chested man, in his late 40s, with a receding hairline and a slow drawl that made every sentence sound like a half-formed warning. He was known for his calm, a trait earned after 20 years of being the first one called and the last one thanked. "There's a man in custody," Dale said without preamble. "Picked him up out near Junction Pines. Illegal animal transport. Been running a string of holding pens along the old logging roads." He paused. "We found a report he filed, sloppy, barely legible. Mentions a female German shepherd found near a ridge. Said she had 2 pups with her. Said he couldn't move them far, left them tied after they bit him." Hank said nothing, but the air in the cabin shifted. Rosie, who had been sleeping by the fire, lifted her head slowly, as if some echo had reached her too. "He didn't name the ridge," Dale continued. "Didn't have to." Hank hung up with thanks, though he didn't remember if he'd spoken them. He didn't need the man's name. He didn't want to see his face. The image was already burned into his imagination, someone who saw a creature still guarding her own and thought to break that devotion with a rope. Later, he dug through a rusted filing box beneath the cot, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were fragments of his past life fire reports, training logs, emergency contact rosters. A folder slid free near the back, its label faded but legible. Rita Hall. She had been part of the regional coordination office during his final year in the service, handling communications between field teams and community shelters. Quiet woman, sharp mind, soft voice. He remembered she always wore a gray wool scarf, even in spring, and carried a battered leather notebook instead of using the new tablets they had issued. Rumor had it, she'd once lost a sibling in the foster system and had never stopped watching windows after that. He searched her name online, found a line buried in a newsletter footer. Rita Hall, Northwest Child Welfare Network, Spokane Division. He opened a blank email and stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. When he wrote, he kept it short, but each sentence bled. "My name is Hank Cooper. I am the father of Madeline Rose Carter. I have no legal evidence, only what the snow didn't bury. A dog named Rosie, a charred collar, a message written in charcoal on stone, and a recording of a lullaby no one else would know. If you have any records of a child, any age, who once mentioned Rosie or drew maps in soot, or spoke of a girl lost to fire, please write back. I'll wait." He hit send, then he waited. Snow drifted in thin, diagonal lines across the field behind the cabin, softening everything it touched. Fence posts blurred into white silhouettes. The pine trees hunched low, like they too had grown tired of winter. Hank Cooper sat at the edge of the kitchen table, hands calloused, waiting for something he couldn't name. It had been 5 days since he sent the message, and though he'd told himself not to expect anything, he found his eyes drawn each morning to the trail leading down to the road, searching for any shape that didn't belong to snow or silence. When the package came, it wasn't carried by a truck or a knock at the door. It had been left inside the mailbox. A thin cardboard envelope, water-streaked, bearing a faded Boise postmark and the unmistakable care of someone who'd sealed it by hand. There was no return address, only his name written in clean black ink, not typed, not official. Inside were 2 letters. The first was from Rita. Her handwriting was even and firm, the kind used by people who'd spent their lives filling forms and comforting without overpromising. The paper smelled faintly of peppermint and ink. 3 years earlier, Rita had taken in a girl around 13, no documents, no clear memory of where she'd come from. The girl had spoken only a few things with clarity, the name Rosie, and mention of a man who drew maps with charcoal. She had been listed as unidentified and transferred to a regional care center after intake. It hadn't connected for Rita until she saw the photo of the dog Hank had sent. The girl's face at that moment hadn't shown surprise. It had shown recognition, like a dam breaking. Rita hadn't claimed authority over what Hank should do next. but she had believed one thing was worth saying, that sometimes memory doesn't vanish, it waits. Hank placed the letter flat on the table, pressing his fingers along its edges as if steadying a fragile truth. He didn't cry, he hadn't in years. But there was something behind his ribs now, a shifting, like ice breaking under pressure. The second letter was smaller, written in pencil. The handwriting was hesitant and young, each letter formed with effort, as though memory itself resisted the act of being captured. No name was signed, but it didn't need one. It told of the fire, how the girl and Rosie had hidden together in a crack in the rocks. Rosie had been hurt, her foot bleeding, her body trembling but still guarding. The girl, thinking no one would ever find them if they stayed, made a choice. She left a map behind and ran. She ran until her legs gave out and memory blurred. When she woke, she was in a stranger's house. She couldn't remember the people, couldn't even recall her own name. When asked who she was, all she could say was, Rosie. She said it again and again, as if the name alone could anchor her to something solid. Everything else slipped away, until the photo arrived. Then, the memories stirred, the sound of boots crunching snow, the quiet rustle of charcoal sketching trails into paper like stories, the sense of being found before the world knew she was lost. She didn't know if anyone had ever kept looking, but hope had never fully left her. She just hadn't known how to name it out loud. The paper trembled slightly in his grip, though his hands didn't move. He read it twice, then again. By the fourth time, he could hear the words in Maddie's voice, not as a teenager's, but as the girl he remembered, her breath hitching between sentences, her fingers gripping a pencil too tightly, trying to be brave for reasons she didn't yet understand. He rose from the table and walked to the wood stove. Rosie stirred from the blanket, her ears lifting, eyes catching his. She had a way of looking that felt like understanding, not just what he said, but what he meant to hide. Her muzzle had grayed slightly in recent weeks, though her posture remained alert, steady. She blinked once, and he nodded. It was time. The next morning, Hank stood by the barn with a duffel bag packed in quiet care. He included a worn flannel shirt, the photo from the ridge, and a tin of charcoal sticks. Though he didn't know why. Maybe for Maddie, maybe for himself. Scout and Daisy circled his boots, too young to know what it meant to leave, but old enough to sense change. Rosie watched from the cabin steps, tail still, eyes locked onto him like a guardian awaiting command. The drive south would take 2 days in winter. Boise was far by road and memory, but he didn't feel the distance the way he used to. Each mile was a narrowing space between belief and proof. Hank didn't call ahead, didn't ask for confirmation. The letter had said enough. By early afternoon, the snow lifted into clear blue skies, the kind Montana reserved for moments too rare to waste. He stopped at the overlook past Willow Ridge, where the valley spilled open like a story retold. Trees dotted the landscape below, brittle but standing, while crows moved slow and careful across the sky, as if they too sensed something sacred. He remembered a day like this years ago. Maddie had been 6, cheeks pink from cold, insisting that Rosie could read clouds. She'd pointed at one and claimed it was a horse, then a map, then a bear. He hadn't corrected her. He had simply drawn what she said onto the bark of a branch with charcoal. He touched the side pocket of his bag where the sticks now rested. That night, he slept in the truck, parked behind a shuttered rest stop. Rosie curled beside him, the heat from her body keeping his thoughts from drifting too far. He didn't dream. He didn't need to. By the time dawn broke over the Idaho line, the road was dry, the air sharp but clear. Rosie sat upright in the passenger seat, as if sensing they were close. A quiet alertness had taken hold in her frame, not anxious, but ready. Hank turned off the highway and followed a 2-lane road toward the address Rita had included in a brief note beneath her letter. The building wasn't what he expected. It was plain brick and modest, tucked between a row of old trees and a chain-link fence wrapped in ivy. A faded sign read, Windsong Regional Care, and 2 children were shoveling salt into the sidewalk cracks with more determination than coordination. A woman in a maroon sweater waved from the doorway. He didn't wave back. He was afraid it would break something inside him. He reached the parking lot, cut the engine, and sat still for a moment. Rosie leaned her head against his arm. He didn't get out. Not yet. Hank still hadn't moved. The engine was off, keys in his lap, but his hands remained resting on the wheel like they were still holding something heavier than the truck. Outside, A fine mist settled over the world. Not quite rain, not quite silence, beating along the windshield in streaks that blurred everything beyond into softness. Rosie sat beside him, head pressed gently against his forearm. She didn't paw the door. She didn't whine. She just waited, still and patient, like she had always been. A quiet reminder that they were already here. In front of them stood Winsong Regional Care Center, a 3-story building of red brick and modest windows. The courtyard was hemmed in by bare trees whose branches reached upward like unanswered prayers. A single bench sat beneath a rusted lamp. There was no fence, no gate. Yet Hank felt like he stood at the edge of something impenetrable, like opening the door would unfasten 6 years of quiet unraveling all at once. He pulled the letter from inside his coat. Not to check it, he knew every word by now, but to hold himself together with it. The girl's handwriting was jagged, uncertain, but the last line never failed to knock the wind from him. She had written that she didn't know if he was still looking, but she had never stopped hoping. He closed his eyes and let the words steady him like a second spine. Then, slowly, he opened the door. Rosie followed. They walked toward the building without ceremony. The rain touched them both gently, like a hand meant to wake but not shake. At the entrance, a young man was already holding the door. He was tall, pale, with rust-colored hair curling behind his ears and a laminated badge clipped to his sweater that read, Eli. His stance was straight, but the way he shifted from foot to foot betrayed a nervous energy he didn't know where to place. He asked Hank's name, quietly, almost like a whisper. Hank nodded, and Eli, already informed, likely by Rita, had everything in order. There was no clipboard, no forms. Just a short nod, and the door opening a little wider. She was awake, down the west hall. The building smelled like paper and hand soap, the kind of place that tried to be safe without pretending to be home. They passed framed children's drawings in bright crayon colors, bulletin boards with uneven tacks, and a potted plant trying its best near the corner window. The walls were painted soft green, the color of patience. No one stopped them. Rosie's nails clicked softly on the floor. A nurse with deep smile lines passed by with a tray of tea and offered Hank a quiet, almost reverent smile. The whole place seemed to know what was about to happen and had agreed to move gently around it. At the end of the corridor, Eli paused before a pale wooden door. She doesn't know exactly when, but she knows today. He opened the door without knocking. The room was small bed neatly made, books stacked unevenly on the desk, and a wide window overlooking the same wet trees that had lined the entrance. A girl sat on the edge of the bed, her back to the door, spine straight but not tense. Her hair fell loose down her back, long and dark, its ends curling slightly in the humidity. She didn't turn when the door opened. Then Rosie gave a sound low and deep, a single soft whimper that seemed to pull every molecule of the room inward. The girl turned. She looked older than the memory Hank had held onto. Of course she did, but her eyes were the same, large and hazel, too expressive for someone who had learned to live with silence. For a second, neither moved. The space between them filled not with surprise, but recognition that went deeper than logic. A thread pulled taut, then released. Dad? It was barely a whisper, the kind of word not spoken so much as remembered. Hank took one step, then another. His arms opened, not wide, but sure. And Maddie rose and crossed the room in a rush of breath and tears, falling into the only place that had ever felt like hers. She didn't sob, not loudly, but her shoulders shook and her hands fisted the fabric of his coat like she meant to fold into it. Her breath came in quick, broken pulls, as if her lungs had to relearn what relief felt like. He held her without words. Rosie circled once, then lay down at their feet, her head pressed gently against Maddie's ankle. Her eyes closed slowly, like a long-held vigil had just ended. She made no sound. They stayed there, no clock marked the moment, and no one came to hurry them. Outside the window, the rain continued. Maddie didn't let go. Hank didn't ask her to. When the sky turned the color of cooled iron, they left. No suitcase, no belongings. Just Rosie, Hank, and a girl who had waited too long to belong again. They drove north. The road bent through valleys washed clean by winter's edge. Snow remained in patches, stubborn and bright, but the trees whispered spring's approach. Maddie slept most of the way, curled under Hank's old coat. Rosie curled behind the seat, one paw resting across her lap, like she meant to anchor her there. They arrived after dark. The porch light buzzed to life, flickering once before holding. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and old flannel. The pups woke as the door opened, blinking against the lamp glow, and toddled forward uncertainly. When they reached Maddie, they didn't bark. They climbed into her lap like they'd been waiting. She didn't ask their names, she just smiled. Hank stoked the fire, while Rosie returned to her spot beside the hearth. Maddie climbed into her old bed without a word. The dogs burrowed against her legs. Rosie stood sentry for a moment longer, then curled at the foot like nothing had ever changed. At the kitchen table, Hank pulled out a page he had once left blank, its corners curled with time. He wrote slowly, the pen heavy in his fingers. The words weren't grand, just enough. Beneath the ash, warmth still lingers. Some fires don't burn away. They slip into memory, waiting for someone to believe enough to come back. The quietest journeys often leave the deepest marks. This story reminds us that love is not always loud. It's the waiting, the remembering, the returning when no one else believes. In life, we all carry promises, people, or hopes we've nearly let go. But sometimes, holding on a little longer is what brings us home. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe again. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and tell us, what have you been holding on to, even in the silence?